So I'm Mike Vasili. Thank you for the introduction there. I mostly work with startup medical device companies, small companies, people that are venture backed. That's most of my background, but I have worked through them with some larger organizations. Before I talk about what Agile is and how you can apply it, I thought, just as some background for you folks, that the clicker doesn't work. That I'd say a little bit about why you might want to adopt Agile practices. And really, fundamentally, it comes down to staying competitive in a changing market. Agile is responding to change. And a lot of what we find in engineering has been resistance to change. The processes that we put in place have said, no, it's not the right time for us to do that. The requirements are locked, the software is frozen. But that never actually works out. The real world continues moving on. There's always change in your process. And by being agile, it's really understanding and accepting that that change will come. So let's get good at dealing with it. And so by doing that, it'll allow you to stay competitive as your market changes, as your understanding of the product changes, as the staff changes. And so that will give you the ability to build a product that your customers want, regardless of what they told you they wanted. Get it to market quickly, maybe in increments, where they can start to understand how it works and roll it into their processes. Do it with higher quality. We'll talk about how to do that, and lower risk. So I looked through the audience and trying to decide what stories I can tell. There's no one here from this project that I worked on about 12 years ago, so I think it's safe to describe that. There was a small engineering company just down the road here that got a very large contract from a major pharmaceutical company for a completely automated drug testing facility. And this thing was really remarkable. It was capable of doing about a dozen different tests on pills that the manufacturer had over the course of time. And they wanted to replace a process that was very manual, took a lot of time, was expensive, got inconsistent results. And the vision for this product was to have, like I said, a completely automated system. There were even little robotic carts that would pick up the pills and carry them from place to place. When I started on the project, I had one little piece of it that I was responsible for, and we had plenty of budget, a good amount of time. We had a pretty clear picture of what the customer wanted. And yet, 2.5 years later, we ended up with one test that kind of worked, and it was labor intensive to keep it running, and the results were inconsistent, and the customer wasn't very happy. And towards the end of that project, I did a lot of soul searching as well as the other people there. Said, what is it that we could have done differently? Because we were following all the best practices. We were all CMMI certified. We had a FDA compliant QSR. We had a project management office that knew all the right things, but it still failed. And so I started doing some research, and I found that I wasn't the only one to have this problem. A few years earlier, a dozen or so folks had come from mostly the financial business services industry, and were seeing sort of similar problems with their projects, where they had put things together, they thought they had a good idea of what the customer wanted, and when it actually came to it, it wasn't the right thing, didn't work the way they wanted, the pieces didn't all fit together. And so, they came together through that community and said, what are the things that can help us to do a better job? And they came up with what's now known as the Manifesto for Agile Software Development. And their focus really was strictly software development. As Eric said, we'll hear about later this evening about how you can apply that to systems and hardware. But what they found was that there were, in their view, 4 critical things that we weren't doing right in the way we managed these projects. When we talk about projects, I'm mostly talking about new product development, which is a lot of what we see in medical device industry, is new techniques, new technologies, new ways to roll it out. So new product development, you know that there's going to be change, you know that there's going to be things that you don't understand as you roll along. And what they found was that it was more important, as they say here, to value individuals and their interactions instead of processes and tools. But it's more important to have working software at the end of a project than to have complete documentation. That it's more important to have a partnership with your customer than to have contract negotiations. And that it's more important to be able to respond to the changes that come along rather than say, nope, that wasn't part of our plan, that's not how we're going to do things. And so I found this community of people, and I said, okay, how can we apply that to the types of work that I do? And what I found was that in this project that I described earlier, the way that we started out was we had isolated developers. We were all sitting in our cube. We had our particular thing that we were responsible for. I was responsible for making sure the communication between the different devices all worked, mostly RS-232 serial crap. But I didn't have, at least initially, a big picture of where the project was going. And that limited my ability to work within the system, to design it, to make sure that all the pieces fit together. We had, like I said, state-of-the-art tools, case tools, if you remember those, UML, lots of diagrams about how this whole thing was supposed to fit together. But that was all built from the beginning of the project when we had one vision of what the product was before we actually started working with the hardware, before we actually started running the tests, before we got some results from actually testing these devices. The way that we communicated our status was you'd have a meeting once a week and you'd tell your boss everything's fine. Until the time when you finally had to own up and say, no, it's not. And then at the end of the project, usually when the schedule said, oh, it's time for integration, all the pieces came together. Of course, they didn't fit. And there was, after that, long hours, crunch time, trying to get all the pieces together. We said, this is why we need to value people, individuals, and their interactions instead of relying on the tools to do our job for us. Because they're there to help, they're important, but it's really the people talking to one another and having those conversations that's crucial. The other thing is, we work in the medical device community. We have an obligation to document what we do. Many times we take that further than makes sense, I think. We tend to document everything because we can, rather than documenting the things which are important. We had in this project complete product requirements. We said, we've talked to the customer, we've negotiated this contract, this is how much they're going to pay us to fulfill these requirements. They're locked now. You can't change them. Of course, as soon as you find out what the tests actually do, or how the hardware actually works, or when you start interviewing the customer and find out how they want to use it, you realize, well, when you said that, what you probably really meant was this. But the attitude in that project, in many projects, is arm's length relationship with the customer. We've got a contract. We've got change orders. It's going to be expensive if you want to change anything. And that often leads to projects that are failures. We had a requirement within our QSR that the detailed design for the whole system was done before anyone started coding. And the reality is that as much as you might understand about the system, when you start to code, when you start to put those pieces together, you learn more about it, inevitably. And as you learn, you find ways that you can build a better system. So we couldn't do any code until the design docs were approved. Of course, once the design docs were approved, we said, okay, let's now start it. First thing you realize is that there are disconnects somewhere, pieces didn't line up properly despite doing as good a job as possible. So that's why these guys, and in the Agile community now, we say we value working software over comprehensive documentation. That's not to say that the documentation isn't important, and certainly from a design control perspective, it's important that we're able to demonstrate the work that we've done. We need to be able to demonstrate the tests that we've done and the satisfactory application of those tests. But there's really no requirement to have detailed design at the level of, this piece will go to that piece, to go to that piece, to go to that piece. In excruciating detail. It wasn't the intention of the FDA when they developed the design control guidelines. They wanted to know what design choices you made, what kind of trade-offs you looked at, how you evaluated them, how you considered risk. And those are important things for us to document. But to go to that level before you're actually building the product usually ends up in a lot of wasted time and arguments and dissatisfaction between you and the customer. Contract negotiations. I mentioned earlier that we had an adversarial relationship with the customer because they said we'd like you to do these things. We said we didn't sign up for that. That's going to cost more money. When you can establish a relationship with your customer where you are partners and that they recognize that this is a goal, we have a shared vision of what we want to accomplish, but that we will learn more about this as we go along, and as we learn, we'll be able to build a better product, we'll be able to build it cheaper, we'll be able to get it to you into your hands sooner. One of the mantras for Agile software development is to give you the software that you need rather than the software that you think you want. And you can do that by getting it into people's hands quickly. In the medical device community, that means often doing an early clinical trial or an initial demonstration to the customer. You don't need to have a full-blown system before you can start to show them, gee, this is how it's going to work when a nurse picks up your device and starts to use it at the bedside. This is the information the doctor is going to be able to see to make a diagnostic evaluation. And from those things, you can learn more about your customer's workflow, how they're going to actually use these devices. And finally, planning. Planning is sort of front and center with the guidance from the FDA. But that planning means that they want, and you have an obligation to consider at the beginning of the project and as you go along how you're going to conduct business. That doesn't mean come up with a plan that's rigid, that you stick to, that promises exactly what will be done throughout the project. FDA recognizes that that's not the case, that these plans are living documents that need to evolve as you go through the project, as you learn about things. We had this project that I mentioned earlier, a Gantt chart that took up maybe about half of this wall on the side that you could only read if you got up close enough to it. And the way the project was managed was, these are our tasks, this is the work breakdown structure, it's not going to change. How far are you done with that task? Well, that task might not even be relevant anymore, but we needed to say, oh, we're 80% done, we're 85% done, we're 90% done, 91% done, 92% done. And it never got finished. And that's the problem when you rigidly stick to a plan instead of having a plan be guidance for you to evaluate how you're going to proceed with the project. This probably looks familiar to most of you. This is what's known as the classic waterfall model. The idea is that at the beginning of a project, before we sit down, we're going to define what the requirements are, how this thing is supposed to work. We'll design it. Once the design is complete, we'll implement it. Once we've implemented it, we'll verify that it does what it's supposed to do, and then we'll release it, put it into the field, and let it be maintained. It's simple, it's clean, it's cognitively easy to grasp, and I think that's what has led to the acceptance of this as a way to do new product development. It's very easy to understand how the pieces go together. And when we talk about work in a FDA environment, we say, okay, we've got requirements and architecture, detailed design, and then after we do it, we go back up the other side of the V. That's how we do verification and then validation. Make sure it works the way that we intended it to work. Make sure it works the way the customer wants it to work. And this is a good model except for one thing. This line on the bottom says time and it points in one direction. That's just not the way it works in reality. I mean, why would you want to wait until the very end of the project to put it in your customer's hands and say, this is what you wanted, right? It makes no sense to wait for the end of that. And so what people inevitably do is they say, all right, well, this is kind of the way we do it, but there's some iteration here. We kind of go around a couple of times. When you look at the guidance from the FDA on verification of medical devices, they show a diagram which is pretty similar to this. I think I have it in the slide deck later on. And the text that goes along with that image says, this is how we imagine that most of your projects are going to work. Now, we realize that there will be iteration, that there will be you'll have to go back around a couple of times. But we left all that out so that we could focus on what the design control stuff is. And unfortunately, when people see that diagram, they say, oh, this is how we're supposed to do it. They don't read the fine print that says, oh, there's really supposed to be iteration. They say, I got to do one, I got to do the other. And the problem that happens is, a lot of times, that gets codified into our quality system. And our quality system ends up having requirements in it that say, or parts of process elements that say, you can't do this until you do something else. We've got stage gate review before you can move on to the next level of the product development. That wasn't the intention of the FDA when they developed the design control legislation. There's a recognition among software developers, among medical device developers now, and FDA regulators that you need to be able to accommodate changing requirements, that you'll end up with a safer product if you put the device in the customer's hands so you can get that feedback earlier. This is what a similar diagram for an Agile project looks like. And it's a lot more complicated than that simple waterfall. It's not as easy to grasp at first. But the idea is, and you can see that it's built on the idea that there will be constant iteration throughout the life cycle of the projects. And we talked a little bit about this down at the bottom. And this is targeted mainly at software development, but you can imagine, and Nancy will describe, how you can apply it beyond just that. But at the lowest level, you have software developers writing code. And an iteration cycle of seconds sometimes, or minutes of, I've written something, I've tested it, I've reviewed it with someone else, it works, I can commit it, I can check it in, it's now part of the next release of the product. And then at the next cycle out, you have pair programming, which is an activity that we do in software where you have two software engineers that sit side by side working on the same module, the same bit of code. Often one will write some code, the other one will write a test that tests to make sure that code works properly, where they might write a test first and say, this is something that we want this particular module to do. Now you write the code that makes it pass. So you see that you validate the test almost beforehand by making sure that this is something that the software product doesn't currently do, that it needs to do, and you see that it fails. Then you add in the code to make it work, and you see that it passes, and you check that in, and that's good for the next version of your project. The important factor of that, and one of the things that makes this iterative cycle support the ability to change as the requirements of the project change, is that you've now built up, as you're going along, a set of tests, a set of automated tests that can make sure that your product behaves in a certain way. What I recommend that we do when my teams work on this is they develop tests against requirements. So what's the next requirement that we're going to satisfy in our product? Let's build up those automated tests as we go along, rather than giving that to a separate group to develop, or waiting until the end of the product to say, okay, now we're going to develop a test suite. If you develop that test suite incrementally as you go along, and now you say, oh, we found out something's not right, so our understanding of the project has changed somewhat, or the customers asked for something different, or we found out that there's some new technology, or there's a competitor that has come in and said there's a different technique that we might be able to use, and we want to be able to take advantage of that. I can still say I've got this automated test suite that I can run that gives me confidence that as I make those changes, I've only made the changes that I need to, and I haven't broken the things that I shouldn't have. Beyond that, it goes up to peer negotiation, where you get all the members of the team working on the different parts of the project. On a daily basis, all the members of the team get together. And there's a little bit of a formalism about the stand-up meeting, or sometimes some people call it a scrum meeting, where it's not a status meeting per se. It's a very short meeting that's targeted at, what did I get done yesterday? To keep everybody abreast. What am I planning on doing today? And what am I blocked on? What do I need help with? And so usually for a team of 8, 10, 12 development, you can get that meeting done in 10 minutes. You say, well, you gotta meet every day. It's only 10 minutes every day. And it ends up actually often being less than what a staff meeting might be once a week. That daily cadence then builds up into acceptance tests for the, in Agile it's known as stories, but effectively their requirements are very narrow requirements, the things that you want to accomplish. Those, as the code or as the system gets built up enough to be able to satisfy an individual requirement, you've got the acceptance tests that you build up alongside it, and you work with your QA department, a representative of the customer, either a customer member of the customer team that works with you, or someone who represents their interests, to make sure that the acceptance tests that you've defined actually satisfy those requirements. And guess what? That now becomes part of your traceability matrix. And you've got your traceability matrix that you build up as you go through the whole process, rather than waiting until the end to say, oh, I've got a spreadsheet that I got to put together. Those acceptance tests then go into weekly, usually 2 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, iterations, where you say, at the beginning of the iteration, as a team, we expect to work on these 3 or 5 or 6 stories, requirements, and then you get agreement from stakeholders, management, customers, that those are the most important things to be working on next. You don't need to, there's no obligation, there's no really good reason to say, over the next 6 months, these are the things that I'm going to be working on in this order, because as you go along, you're going to realize that you found out that some aspect of your system represents more risk than you originally thought. And you want to get that working sooner so you can understand what those risks are, develop the mitigations that you need. You might find out that gee, there's some part of the system that we thought was important, but the customer said, I don't really care about that, or I don't care about that right now, or that's not what I want in the first release that I get. So the opportunity then at the 2 and 3 week iteration cycle is to look and see what's important, what's the most important thing for us to do next, whether it's because it's an important feature or because it's something we don't understand that we need to evaluate the risk on. The other thing is that's an opportunity for you to develop and flush out your risk assessment. As you go along, you say, I now know more about the design of the system. I know that there are ways that we've implemented this that might represent a failure in the system that could potentially cause harm. Let's put that in to our risk assessment plan as we go through this meeting. Add that to the list. That's another one. That's another one. Those become stories then that you'll work on through that iteration. And then those iterations build up over the course of 3 months, 4 months, 6 months into a release. You don't want to wait 2 years before getting something that's nominally functional into customers' hands. You don't have to have the complete product done. You're not going to get clearance from the FDA in that time frame, not for a new product anyway, but that doesn't mean that you can't get something out into their hands to start evaluating, testing, doing user studies, doing summative testing on it. This is the model for Agile software development. The way that so fundamental idea with Agile is you want to be able to respond to change. One thing that you're going to understand as you go along is that the quality system that you have in place is going to be something that you may want to change. You may find that there are some things that don't support the work that you want to do in a convenient way. One of my clients, we just changed the way that we handle acceptance testing to allow us to do more automated testing as part of that. And so those things are going to change as you go along. Those are the most important things. But the community of Agile software developers has, over the last 10, 12 years, developed some common things that help you to accommodate change. And one of those is to have small interdisciplinary teams that work closely together. Developers, testers, customer proxies, QA, all working together as part of this constant cadence of iteration. Requirements characterized as user stories. User story typically means something that says, as a nurse, doctor, patient, biomed, I want to be able to do something with a product that I've got. And importantly, as a something, I want to do something because. That's the reason why it's important to the person in the beginning of that clause. And that helps you to define why it is that you're doing it. A lot of times our requirements are divorced from the actual rationale of how they came to be in the first place. So the important characteristic of the story is it says why it's important to the software product, why it's important to the customer. So I can mitigate the risk of a particular harm. So I can make sure that the workflow is consistent with the way a nurse operates at the bedside. Those stories then represent the unit of work that the developers work on. The user stories, as I mentioned earlier, are prioritized in your backlog. A lot of times this is the hardest job for stakeholders, for management. It's, well, all of these things are important to me. It's like, all right, I understand that they're all important to you. Tell me which one is more important. Well, they're all important. Well, I have a choice. I got to start working on one of these. I either work on this one or that one. Which one is more important? If we run out of money, or if we run out of time, or if the organization says, look, this project is done, we've got to ship, which one do you want to have in? If you've got to lose one, what's it going to be? So you need to be able to make those hard calls about the prioritization stories. Daily stand-up I described. this is the model from the GPSV. It says, I'm going to do essentially waterfall. And that's why, that's I think how we as a community, Eric mentioned earlier that the medical device community has been slower to adopt these techniques. It's because, I know for me, when I've gone into customers, less so now, clients, when I've gone in and said, look, the best way to run this project is with an agile methodology, they'll say no. It's like GPSV says I got to do it this way. If you read the fine print, it says yes, but there's going to be iterations. And now people are understanding that although these diagrams don't look the same, in practice when you were doing this, you were ending up iterating a lot more than you thought you were, or than you intended to. So where did like I said, initially the FDA was skeptical about Agile. The auditors, when they came in, if you said that you were doing user stories or iterations, they said, I don't know what you're talking about. If they said, where's your design inputs? Like, we don't call them design inputs. Got them completely confused. So the FDA realized, and some people at the FDA realized, that there were problems with the existing ways that devices were being built. There was a recognition that many MDRs were a result of changes, particularly changes in software, and they started to look into, like I had started to look into, ways to make these products and projects work better, how to be safer, how to be more effective. The goals of the Agile community and the FDA are very well aligned in that we want it to work right. We want it to be able to build the product that the customer wants, and we want it to be safe. So in 2009, AMI, the Association for the Advancement of Medical Instrumentation, which is probably many of you are members of, it's a group of medical device manufacturers, users, medical community, and regulators that work together on standards. They're responsible for the U.S. position on 1345, on 62304, on 60601. They said, look, how can we provide guidance not just to the medical device community, but to FDA regulators and auditors on how to safely apply Agile techniques to medical devices? Because there was a perception that Agile just meant do whatever you feel like, you don't have to document anything. In practice, Agile is more disciplined than most other types of software development. There's a particular cadence. You have to work on the items that are most important. You have to develop your tests as you go along. That discipline is there.